For 13 years, Renata Voss was the reason the lights stayed on in her family's house. She was 39 years old, a structural engineer with her own small consulting firm, and for as long as anyone in her family could remember, she had also been the quiet machine that kept everything running. Her father died when she was 26, a heart attack in a parking garage on an ordinary Tuesday, and within a month Renata had become the person who paid the mortgage, negotiated with the bank, and signed the papers nobody else wanted to read. Her mother, Diane, had never worked outside the home and had no idea how to read an amortization schedule. Her younger brother, Colton, was 22 at the time, 3 semesters from finishing a business degree he would eventually abandon in favor of what he called building a brand. Renata never sat anyone down and announced that she was taking over. It simply happened the way water finds the lowest point in a room. She covered the mortgage for 8 months until the house could be refinanced in her mother's name alone, with Renata as co-signer. She paid off Colton's final year of tuition when his financial aid fell through. When he decided at 26 that college had been a waste of time and that his real calling was social media marketing, she was the one who wired him $11,000 to buy a camera rig, a ring light, and 3 months of rent while he built what he called his portfolio. When that portfolio turned into an actual agency, Voss Media he named it, though she noticed later he'd dropped Voss for something snappier the moment it started making money. She was the one who co-signed the lease on his first office space, because no landlord would rent to a 28-year-old with no credit history and a folder of screenshots. She did all of this without complaint, mostly because complaining had never occurred to her as an option. In the Voss family, love was expressed through provision. Her mother said it plainly more than once over the years, "You're the strong one, Rennie. You don't need anybody fussing over you." It was meant as a compliment. Renata had absorbed it as a job description. She was good at her job. Voss Structural Consulting had 4 employees now, a modest office above a bakery in the old part of downtown, and a reputation for showing up on time and telling clients the truth even when the truth was expensive to hear. She liked concrete and steel because they didn't pretend to be something they weren't. A beam either held the load or it didn't. There was a comfort in that kind of honesty that she did not often find in people. She was also, by her own private accounting, tired in a way that had stopped being new years ago and had simply become weather. She noticed it most on Sunday nights, doing the family's books at her kitchen table. Her mother's, Colton's, sometimes both, categorizing expenses into neat columns while her own retirement account sat mostly untouched because there was always somewhere else the money needed to go first. She told herself this was temporary. She had been telling herself that for 13 years. Colton's wedding was the first weekend of June, at a converted barn venue 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with market lights strung between reclaimed beams and a name like Thistle and Oak. His fiancée, Priya, ran a skincare page with 200,000 followers, and the wedding had been planned from what Renata could tell primarily as content. There had been a save-the-date reel with a drone shot. There had been a bridal shower live-streamed from a rooftop. Renata had watched some of it from her phone, alone in her apartment, feeling the specific loneliness of being tagged in a caption, "Couldn't have done any of this without my family," while not actually being pictured in any of the photos. She had, of course, paid for a significant portion of it. Not the whole wedding. Priya's parents had contributed too, and Colton's agency was doing well enough now that he covered some costs himself. But when the caterer needed a deposit 6 weeks before the date and Colton called her sounding panicked, saying the venue would cancel the booking without it, Renata had transferred $18,000 within the hour. He'd called it a bridge loan. "Just until the agency's Q2 invoice is clear," he'd said. "I'll pay you back with interest, Ren, I promise, this is just a cash flow thing." She hadn't asked to see the invoices. He never did. Trust in her family flowed one direction, and she had stopped noticing the current a long time ago. She arrived at the wedding in a navy dress she'd bought for the occasion, her hair done properly for once, feeling something close to anticipation. She had, if she was honest with herself, been looking forward to this. Not the spectacle of it, she didn't care about the flowers or the specialty cocktail named after the couple, but the simple, almost embarrassing hope that today of all days she might get to just be Colton's sister. Not the accountant. Not the emergency contact. Just family in a good dress watching her little brother get married. The wedding coordinator found her in the gravel lot before she'd even reached the barn doors. A young woman with a headset and a clipboard, polite but brisk, the way people are when they're managing a schedule and not a person. Renata? I'm so glad I caught you. There was a last-minute change to the seating. Derek and Priya wanted to make sure the immediate wedding party photos had the right flow, so guests seating near the front got adjusted a little. You're actually going to be over on the east side, table 19, but it's got a lovely view of. I was at table 2, Renata said. She had seen the chart weeks ago. A mock-up Colton had sent her over text with a laughing emoji. Sister of the groom, obviously front row, don't at me. Next to Aunt Lorna. The coordinator's smile stayed fixed, the particular smile of someone who has been told not to relitigate decisions made above her pay grade. There was a request to open that seat up. A +1 situation, I believe, for content reasons. The couple wanted certain people positioned for the video team's angles. I'm really sorry, I know this isn't ideal, but Colton did want me to let you know, and he asked if you could maybe hang back near the wall by the bar during the formal family photos, just so the frame isn't too crowded. He said you'd understand that you're not really a photo person anyway. Renata stood very still for a moment. Somewhere behind the coordinator, through the open barn doors, she could see the head table being finished. White linens, a runner of white roses, a name card in careful calligraphy that was not hers propped where hers should have been. A young woman in a cream jumpsuit was arranging a ring light on a small tripod at what would have been Renata's seat, testing angles, checking her phone screen with the particular satisfaction of someone confirming their own good lighting. Who is she? Renata asked. Not really a question. That's Bree, she's Priya's content partner, they collaborate on brand deals. I think she's covering the wedding for some kind of sponsored series. I really am sorry, this all came together kind of last minute. Renata did not make a scene. This was, she would later think, the most Voss thing about the whole afternoon. That even in the moment her family quietly told her she was furniture, her first instinct was to protect the schedule, not disrupt it. She thanked the coordinator, who looked relieved, and she walked to table 19, which did in fact have a lovely view of the parking lot, and beyond it a stand of pine trees, and beyond that nothing at all. She sat through the ceremony from the back corner of the guest section, arriving late to her own seat because she'd needed several minutes alone in her car first, hands on the steering wheel, breathing the way she used to before big client presentations. She watched her brother, in a suit she was fairly sure she had helped pay for, promise Priya that he would build a life with her built on honesty and partnership. She watched their mother dab at her eyes in the front row, in the seat that should have had Renata beside her. During the formal family photographs, a groomsman found her by the bar, not unkindly, just doing what he'd been told, and asked if she wouldn't mind stepping back a little, just out of frame. They were trying to keep the group tight. She stepped back. She stood near the wall in her navy dress, holding a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, and watched Bree from the ring light seat pose beside Colton with her arm looped through his, laughing at something, radiant in a spot at a family photo that Renata had occupied at every holiday, every graduation, every ordinary Tuesday dinner for 13 years, and that today had simply been assigned to someone else because she photographed better. She did not cry. She had a strange, clarifying thought instead, standing there against the reclaimed wood wall with the market lights starting to glow gold above her as the afternoon dimmed. This is what it looks like when the invoice finally comes due, and it turns out I was never actually a line item on the asset side. She found her way to table 14 almost by accident during the reception, looking for a quiet corner to sit and recompose herself before the toasts started. Table 14 was where the wedding planning team had been seated. The coordinator, a couple of assistants, and it turned out the venue's event manager and Priya's wedding planner, a woman named Sable who had clearly had 2 glasses of wine and had stopped being careful about her volume. No, the whole vendor list got shuffled twice, Sable was saying to the coordinator, because they kept running out of money and then finding more. It was the weirdest planning process I've had all year. First the caterer deposit bounced, then 2 days later it's paid in full plus a rush fee, and I'm like, okay, whatever, rich people problems, and then the florist tells me the same thing happened with the final balance. Bounced, then paid same day with extra for the inconvenience. I asked Priya about it once just to make sure we weren't going to have issues at the actual event, and she laughed and said, "Oh, that's just Derek's sister, she's basically our emergency fund, don't worry about it." Renata, half hidden by a floral centerpiece, went very still. "The sister who's not even at the head table?" the assistant asked. "Right, exactly, I thought that was so strange. I actually asked Priya about the seating chart because normally the groom's family gets priority placement, and she said, I'm not trying to be dramatic, I'm just repeating it. She said, she's not really wedding photo material, and honestly she doesn't care about that stuff, she's more useful behind the scenes." Which, I mean, okay, if that's the dynamic, not my business. But then Bree needed the seat for the content deal and I guess it just worked out. Renata sat with that sentence for a long moment. She's basically our emergency fund. Turning it over the way she'd turn over a stress calculation that didn't add up, looking for the error except there wasn't one. The math was completely correct. She just hadn't wanted to see the final number before now. She thought about the $18,000. The bridge loan. Q2 invoices that would clear any day now. She thought about the caterer deposit that had bounced and then been paid in full, same day with extra for the inconvenience. Extra that Colton had certainly not had lying around. Not if he'd needed an emergency bridge loan from his sister just weeks before. She did the arithmetic her family had never once asked her to do on their behalf, and she arrived with the same cold clarity she brought to a load-bearing calculation at the obvious conclusion. Her business loan had not gone to Voss Media's cash flow at all. It had gone into the wedding. Into the florist. Probably into the ring light currently sitting where her name card should have been. She did not confront anyone at table 14. She simply stood, smoothed her navy dress and walked toward the gift table near the barn's entrance, where a low arrangement of eucalyptus framed a white card box and beside it, a scatter of wrapped presents and envelopes. Near the back, tucked where she'd placed it that morning with her own hands, was a heavy cream-colored envelope with Colton and Priya's names in her own handwriting. Inside it was a check for $20,000, her actual wedding gift separate from the bridge loan, the number she'd chosen because it felt significant, generous, the kind of gift that said I am proud of you and I want to help you start this life rather than the kind of gift that simply said here is more money as usual. She had written that check 3 days ago with something that had felt at the time very close to love. She picked the envelope up, turned it over once in her hands and put it in her purse. Nobody stopped her. Nobody was watching the gift table during the toasts, and by the time the best man, one of Colton's college roommates who told a rambling story about a spring break trip that had nothing to do with Priya at all, finished speaking, Renata had already found her car in the gravel lot and was sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off, the envelope on the passenger seat beside her like something that had washed up rather than something she'd carried out herself. She did not decide in that moment to declare war on her family. That was not who she was, and it was not, in the end, what happened. What happened was quieter and she would come to think, more honest than any confrontation could have been. She drove home. She hung the navy dress in her closet, where it would stay for a long time before she could look at it again without a small twist of nausea. She made tea she didn't drink. And she sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had done 13 years of other people's books. And she opened her laptop and really looked for the first time at the full history of what she had given. It took her most of the night. She was an engineer. She trusted spreadsheets over feelings, and so she built one cell by cell the way she might map load paths through a building. Every transfer to her mother going back to the year after her father died. Every tuition payment. The camera rig, the ring light, the 3 months of rent, the co-signed lease that was still for years later, entirely in her name on the landlord's books even though Colton had promised twice to refinance it once his credit improved. The bridge loan. She totaled it at the bottom of the sheet the way she'd total a materials estimate, and the number that appeared, $211,000 13 years unindexed for inflation, sat on her screen with a kind of terrible neutrality, the way any true number does. It did not care how it made her feel. It simply was. Beneath it she typed a single line, not for anyone else, just for herself. Assets given, $211,000. Assets returned, a seat by the wall. She closed the laptop and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming about anything at all. The call started 2 days later. Her mother first, mid-morning, breathless in the particular way Diane got when she'd rehearsed something and was afraid of forgetting it. Renata, honey, I need to ask you something and I need you to not be upset. Priya noticed the gift envelope was gone from the table. She thinks maybe it got misplaced by the venue, but I told her I'd check with you since you were near there. Did you happen to see it? Did someone maybe hand it to you for safekeeping? I took it back, Renata said. There was a silence on the line long enough that Renata checked to see if the call had dropped. You, Renata, that's a wedding gift, you can't just... What will Priya's family think? What will people say? I don't know, Mom. What did people think when I was told to stand by the wall so I wouldn't ruin the photos? Another silence, shorter this time, filled with the specific discomfort of someone who has been asked to defend a decision she hadn't made but had accepted anyway. That was I'm sure that was just a logistics thing. Weddings are chaotic, you know how these things. It's fine, Renata said, and meant it in the flattest possible sense. Not that it was acceptable, but that she was done relitigating it with someone who had watched it happen from the front row seat that should have been hers and said nothing. I'm not angry at you for the seating chart, Mom. I'm done being angry at any of it. I just needed my gift back. You're going to embarrass your brother. People are going to ask questions. Then he can answer them, Renata said, the same way he answered questions about where the caterer deposit came from. The line went quiet in a different way after that. The quiet of someone recalculating what she actually knew versus what she'd chosen not to ask. Her mother did not, in the end, ask what Renata meant. Renata did not explain. She said she loved her mother, which was true, and that she needed some time, which was also true, and she hung up before the conversation could loop back to the envelope again. Colton called that evening, and where their mother had been anxious, he was furious in the specific wounded way of a person who has never once had to justify himself to anyone and finds the experience intolerable. $20,000, Renata. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea how that looks? Priya's parents think our family is insane. I imagine it looks like a woman taking back a gift after finding out her brother lied to her about what he needed it for, Renata said. She was standing at her kitchen counter, calm in a way that surprised her, the way concrete is calm under a load it was actually engineered to hold. The bridge loan, Colton. The $18,000 for Q2 invoices. I heard at table 14 from your own wedding planner, exactly where that money went. The caterer. The florist. Not the agency. The wedding. The silence on his end was the confirming kind. It's not that simple, Ren. It was all connected. The agency's cash flow was tight because of the wedding costs. I was going to pay you back either way. I never lied about paying you back. You lied about what the money was for. That's the part one can't get past. Not the amount. The lie. So what, you're punishing me by stealing my wedding gift? I didn't steal anything that belonged to you yet. It was mine until I gave it. I decided not to give it. She let that sit for a second, feeling, almost with surprise, how steady her own voice was. I've given you a lot of things over 13 years, Colton. Tuition. A camera setup. 3 months of rent when you were building your brand. My name on a lease you still haven't taken me off of for years later, even though you promised. I never once asked for anything back except honesty, and I found out at table 14 overhearing your wedding planner, that I'm apparently known in your circle as, basically the emergency fund. Not as your sister. A fund. That's not. Priya didn't mean it like that. I don't actually think she was wrong, Renata said. That's the part that's hard to sit with. I think it was an accurate description. I think I built that description myself, one wire transfer at a time for 13 years, and nobody stopped me because it was working out great for everybody but me. He didn't have an answer for that. He hung up first, which was, Renata thought afterward, probably the most honest thing that happened in the entire conversation. The lease came up 4 days later, which told Renata something about her family's priorities even more clearly than the wedding had. Her mother again, this time in person, sitting stiffly at Renata's kitchen table with the posture of a woman who has come to negotiate and does not want to be there. Colton's agency is expanding, Diane said. They found a bigger office downtown, a real space, the kind of place that gets them serious clients. But the landlord needs a guarantor with an established credit history, and Colton's credit is still, you know how it is, it's still building, and I told him I'd ask you because you've always understood these things better than either of us. You want me to co-sign a new lease. Days after I found out my old bridge loan paid for wedding flowers. It's not the same situation. It's exactly the same situation, Mom. It's the same situation it's been for 13 years. Something comes up, I'm the only one with the credit and the income to fix it, I fix it, and everyone moves on until the next thing comes up. I'm not doing it. Renata. Her mother's voice took on the wounded, disbelieving tone she used when the family machine failed to produce its expected output. He's your brother. Family helps family. After everything your father built for this family, after everything you've... I know what I've done, Mom. I have a spreadsheet. Would you like to see it? Her mother did not want to see the spreadsheet. Renata suspected, and this suspicion would later prove correct, that nobody in her family had ever wanted to actually look at the full number, because the full number made the arrangement impossible to keep calling love. I'm not signing the lease, Renata said again, gently this time, because some part of her still ached at watching her mother's face fall, some old reflex that 13 years of practice had not fully trained out of her. And I want my name off the old one. I'll pay a lawyer to draft the release myself if Colton won't cooperate, but I am not staying on a lease for a business that apparently thinks of me as an ATM that occasionally shows up for photos it wasn't invited into. So that's it? You're just done? After everything? I'm done paying for a seat at a table where I was told to stand by the wall, Renata said. That's not the same as being done with my family. But I think for the first time in 13 years, I get to decide which one of those it is, instead of finding out after the fact from a wedding planner who'd had 2 glasses of wine. Her mother left without finishing her tea. Renata sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, feeling something she didn't immediately recognize because it had been absent from her life for so long. Not triumph, nothing so dramatic, but a kind of settling, the particular quiet that comes after a structure that had been silently overloaded for years is finally, correctly, brought back down to a load it can actually bear. The weeks that followed were not, contrary to what a more cinematic version of this story might promise, full of dramatic reconciliations or satisfying comeuppances. Colton did not lose his agency. Diane did not have some tearful epiphany that undid 13 years of habit in a single conversation. Renata's lawyer sent a formal notice regarding the lease, and after some resistance, Colton found a new guarantor, his father-in-law as it turned out, who had the credit history and apparently no objection to being asked directly instead of having the request routed silently through his daughter's sister-in-law. Renata found this almost funny in a bleak way. It had never actually been impossible to solve these problems without her. It had only ever been easier. What did change, quietly and almost without her noticing at first, was who filled the space that used to be occupied by managing everyone else's crises. Her Aunt Lorna, her father's older sister, a retired schoolteacher who had sat unglamorously at table 2 beside the empty seat that should have held Renata, called her the week after the wedding, not to discuss the envelope or the lease or any of it, but to ask if Renata wanted to come over Sunday for pie, because she'd made too much and it seemed like a waste to eat it alone. Renata went. Lorna did not ask about the wedding, did not offer opinions on the family drama, did not treat her like a cautionary tale or a scandal. She simply put a slice of peach pie in front of her and asked how the consulting firm was doing, and actually listened when Renata talked about a bridge redesign her firm was working on, asking questions that showed she'd been paying attention rather than waiting for her turn to talk. It was such a small thing. It was, Renata realized somewhere around her second slice, one of the only conversations she'd had with a family member in years that hadn't eventually turned into a request. Her employees, too, surprised her in a way she hadn't expected to be surprised by people she saw every weekday. When her office manager, Preeti, noticed Renata had been quieter than usual, she didn't ask invasive questions. She simply started leaving a coffee on Renata's desk each morning, the exact order Renata always got but never remembered to bring for herself. When one of her junior engineers, a nervous young man named Faisal who rarely spoke up in meetings, finally worked up the courage to disagree with one of her load calculations, correctly as it turned out, catching an error she'd made while distracted, she thanked him properly in front of the whole team instead of feeling threatened by it, and watched something in his posture change for the better over the following weeks. It struck her, unexpectedly, that this was what it might look like to be trusted and appreciated without having to buy either one first. She did not cut her family off entirely in the end, though for a while she genuinely considered it. She spoke to her mother again, eventually, a stiff and careful conversation over the phone that did not resolve everything but did establish for the first time a boundary that held. Renata would still come to holidays, would still call to check in, would still love her mother in whatever complicated way adult children love the parents who shaped them imperfectly, but she would not be signing anything, wiring anything, or covering anything without being asked directly and told the truth about what it was for. It was not warm. It was not the reconciliation a different kind of story might have delivered. But it was honest in the specific way concrete is honest, and Renata had come over 13 years of testing beams and calculating loads, to trust honesty over warmth. Colton she saw only once more that summer at Lorna's house of all places, an ordinary Sunday where he'd apparently also been invited for pie, whether by design or coincidence Renata never asked. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just less certain of himself than the version of him she'd watched at the head table in June. He didn't apologize, not exactly. She suspected an actual, unqualified apology was still some distance off, if it ever came at all. But he did say quietly while Lorna was in the kitchen, that the agency had lost 2 clients that summer and that Priya's father, as guarantor, had been asking a lot of pointed questions about the business's financials that nobody had ever thought to ask when Renata was the one signing. That must be uncomfortable, Renata said, and meant it neither cruelly nor kindly, just as a simple observation, the way she might note that a beam was showing stress it hadn't been designed to carry. Yeah, he said. It is. They didn't talk about the wedding or the envelope or table 14. There was nothing left to litigate that hadn't already been settled quietly in the weeks after. Not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the much slower, much less satisfying process of a family finding out, cell by cell, exactly what its books actually looked like once someone stopped quietly balancing them behind the scenes. Renata kept the spreadsheet. She didn't need it anymore, not really. She wasn't planning to present it to anyone, wasn't holding it in reserve as ammunition for some future argument. But she kept it open on her laptop sometimes in the evenings, not to relitigate the number at the bottom but simply to look at the last line she typed the night of the wedding. Assets given, $211,000. Assets returned, a seat by the wall. It had stopped feeling like an accusation over time and started feeling like something closer to a lesson learned the expensive way, the kind of lesson she might, if she were being generous with herself, have eventually needed to learn regardless of how it arrived. What she came to understand, sitting at her kitchen table on ordinary Sunday evenings that no longer involved anyone else's books, was that she had spent 13 years mistaking usefulness for belonging, the way a person might mistake the pressure of a heavy load for the strength of a foundation. A wall can hold weight for a long time before anyone notices it was never designed to bear that much alone. It doesn't announce the strain. It simply holds quietly until one day it doesn't, or until someone finally checks the calculations and finds out how close it had come to failing the whole time. She was not, in the months that followed, a different person exactly. She still answered her mother's calls. She still sent a check when Lorna's roof needed repair, because Lorna had never once asked her for anything else, and because that, unlike the rest, still felt like something freely given rather than quietly extracted. She still did good, honest work at her firm, still told clients the truth even when it cost her business, still trusted a beam that held its load over a person who only claimed to. But she no longer stood by the wall. That more than the money, more than the lease, more than the envelope she'd carried out of a barn in June with her hands shaking and her mind perfectly, coldly clear, was the part that actually changed. She had spent 13 years positioned just outside the frame so that everyone else's picture would look better. And she had finally, at 39, with a spreadsheet and a peach pie and a coffee that appeared on her desk every morning without her having to ask, stepped back into it. The account, as she thought of it sometimes late at night, was closed. Not out of bitterness and not, in the end, out of revenge, whatever anyone else's version of the story might have called it. It was closed the way any honest ledger closes. Not with a dramatic flourish but with a final entry correctly totaled, that no longer needed anyone else's signature to be true.